Here I am in the middle of the massive metropolis of Chicago, one of America's greatest cities. Let's talk about meat. Yep, you heard it, meat. For centuries, if you ate meat, you usually raised it yourself or lived in an area with someone who raised meat and a local butcher. Meat wasn't something you could transport very far because once the animal's dead, the meat goes bad really quickly. Also, not everywhere is the greatest place to raise animals. However, there is one place that is great, the American Great Plains. Cows, for example, love grass, and it was possible to maintain huge herds of cattle and ranches out in the Great Plains. By now, a few decades after America had acquired Chicago, the railroad had been invented. So, we have great populations of cattle out in the Great Plains. And if only we could get that to Chicago with access eventually to the ocean, we could get meat to the eastern United States or even ship it abroad. And now with the railroad, we can transport things like cattle super fast. The cowboys that you're familiar with from all those westerns were mainly employed driving cattle from places like North Texas, Oklahoma, up to railroads that cross the Great Plains to eventually be shipped to Chicago. One end of the line was Abilene, Kansas, where 35,000 cows per year were shipped to Chicago. Now, there are already some enterprising individuals who had made their fortune in meat, as funny as that sounds. These men had been contracted by the US Army to provide protein in the form of meat for soldiers fighting in the Civil War. Once the Civil War ended, these gents saw their next business opportunity. Meat packing factories were set up here in Chicago. Raw cattle would come in to Chicago and they would be slaughtered, preserved, and packed in usually metal tins to ship all across the United States and the world. This lucrative industry meant huge growth in wealth for Chicago and also growth in population because it provided tons of low-skilled labor jobs for the new immigrants pouring into the United States from Southern and Eastern Europe, as well as recently freed blacks who were looking for making a better life with employment and to escape some of the oppressive racial laws of the South. Also, big corporations are known to sometimes cut corners. And this definitely happened in the meatpacking factories. One problem is when you're dealing with slaughtering a lot of animals, there's a lot of waste byproducts. And people just threw it in the river, making Chicago yet again a smelly place. And this bothered a lot of the residents. Because of public sentiment, the meatpacking barons were forced to do something with the waste. And luckily, there's a lot you can do with meat byproducts. Making tallow, making soap, and in fact something called bone meal, which you all might have intimate contact with because it's used for animal feed as well as in cat and dog food. Yet another way that the meatpacking industry cut corners was by packing not always meat. When they were contracted to provide food for American soldiers during the Spanish-American War, starting in 1898, it was found that they had packed massive amounts of already spoiled meat, or meat that was mixed with extraneous things like sawdust and other gross stuff. This bad meat was responsible for the deaths of many American soldiers and the weakening of many more, making them susceptible to tropical diseases in the Caribbean like yellow fever and malaria, so ultimately killing them. Also, our immigrants and Black Americans working in these factories suffered horrible conditions, long working days, sometimes being killed and maimed in the machines on the job. The horrible working conditions and the horrible condition of the meat in these factories all became known through a book, an expose written by a man named Upton Sinclair in the first decade of the 1900s. The book was called The Jungle, and it horrified the American public to learn what was in the meat that they were eating. sometimes parts of humans that were working in the factories. And it caused major regulations to be put on these factories. Upton Sinclair himself converted his diet to vegetarian after learning of what was going into this meat. And many vegans and vegetarians over the last century will trace the origin of their switch to having read The Jungle.